today I'm going to be talking to you about how to use optionals in Swift. So let's first talk about really what is an optional. So an optional is a type in Swift where it can contain either a value or no value. And so let's think a little bit more about what the reasoning behind this optional type is and why Apple even bothered to create this. So in an ideal world, our code is obviously not going to have any time where a variable is undefined. At any given time, we know exactly what's in our variables, and it's always going to be well-defined data. In actuality, we deal with many instances where a variable exists, but it hasn't been populated with data yet. For instance, when you're constructing a variable, or maybe you're trying to get the request from an API call, there are many times where it's not going to represent anything. And in other languages, we have something like nil or null to represent any reference type that doesn't have data. And so the problem with that is, first of all, it only represents reference types, like objects, for instance, and it doesn't represent something like a double or an integer that hasn't been populated. So let's say we want to define some variable x, which is an int, and it doesn't get populated immediately, and later on we're going to populate it with some value. In another language, we'd have to come up with some kind of unorthodox, localized documentation for that, where we write up on some documentation somewhere, oh, in our code we treat integers this way, where we use 0 to represent null data, or we use -2000 or some specific documentation. And we don't want that. We want something that's global, where you don't need to read each individual person's documentation, and we have some kind of global error handling. Okay. So optionals, this is how you declare an optional with the little question mark here. Optionals avoid that because it works for both reference types and value types like integers or doubles, and it's global. So every single person that's using optionals doesn't have to have their own weird little jank individual representation of what it means to be 0. And so some serious other benefits of these optionals are that, one, it's like I said, they're easy to read and universal. Secondly, it forces you to think about when your variables have value or not. So a lot of times when we can be writing code, we're not thinking that this variable is going to have null data at some point, right? We're just trying to think about the times when our variables are populated. So this is good. Optionals really make us engage with our code and avoids errors that way. And then lastly is that when you're using optionals, a compiler can check when your variables have been unwrapped or when they have data. So that's a really huge error, and in my opinion, is perhaps the least salient, but the most beneficial, right? Doesn't seem like a big differentiation, but anytime you're going to be using the compiler to check something rather than having to check it at runtime is going to save you a lot of time during debugging and is going to make the development process a lot smoother. Okay, so now that we understand some of the benefits of using these optionals, easy to read, forces you to think, and that the compiler can check them, let's talk about some use cases where you'd actually want to use an optional. So like I said before, whenever you're declaring an optional, you want to use this question mark after it. If we don't have that, we can just explicitly define it to be a 0. If we don't know what's going to be defined right now, we'll just say question mark. Okay? So let's let possible number, equal 1, 2, 3. So we have right now a string containing what could be represented as an integer, right? So let's do converted number equal, int of, possible number. So this is all taken from Apple's documentation, by the way, this example. So if you want to look that up, feel free. So we have right now a possible number in a string, right? We can clearly see that this is an integer, and we want to convert that using this int cast. So behind the scenes, let's try and print converted number. Okay, see what happens. Okay, so let's look at what's being output here. Optional 1, 2, 3. So why is this being output as an optional? So the reason for that is our casts use optional casting, right? Let's say, for instance, inside here there's hello, right? And we try and cast this as an int. We're not sure that that's going to be cast to something that has meaning. And so if you look here, it actually does become cast to nil, right? It's just one easy example of using an optional where we are trying to perform an operation, but we don't know whether it's going to complete or not. And this might have nil, it might have some value. So to avoid that, we just say, look, this is an optional, and we can check later if that actually has some value. So let's think about how to actually check if our optionals do have value at some point. We use what's called, well, the first example I'm going to go over is just using an if statement and force unwrap. So let's say we want to check if converted number has value. We would just check if it's not nil. Okay, and then if you check that it's not nil, we can do print yay non-nil data. Okay, so basically this is just checking if our optional is not nil, then we can go in here and print yay no nil data. It works. If we just say hello up here though, we are not going to be entering our if statement. Note right here, there's nothing being printed out. So that's just one quick example of how an optional can be unwrapped. Let's say we want to use converted number inside of our if statement. We can do if converted number is not nil, then let's use what's called force unwrapping. So force unwrapping is if you have an optional and you know at some point that you're in a context where that optional certainly has a value, then you can just do converted number force unwrap. This exclamation point means that you're force unwrapping it and it assumes it has a value. So now if we print the unwrapped, force unwrapped version of converted number, if we look on the side, we're going to get 1, 2, 3. And let's contrast that with right up here where we don't unwrap it, we have the optional containing 1, 2, 3. Okay. There's another thing we can do, which is called shadowing or optional binding, and this is just very good practice, and I'll explain a little bit more about this. So let's say we want to use converted number without having to force unwrap it as we do right here. So we're going to do if local number equal converted number. Then in this context, we'll just try and print local number. Okay, let's see what happens with this. Boom, right there, we get 1, 2, 3. So let's think about what's happening here. We're saying if converted number can be set to be local number, then just use local number with the value of converted number in the context of this if statement. Okay, and one thing to note is this local number becomes useless outside of that. See, there's no such thing as local number out here. Outside of the context of this if statement, local number doesn't exist, and we're going to get an error, right? Local number hasn't been defined yet. So this is just essentially you want to in the context of this if statement, you can use the value of converted number. So one more thing about optional binding is that it doesn't really have a key difference over using something like checking if the optional is nil or not, and then using force unwrapping inside this safe context. I just prefer optional binding, as do some other programmers, because it just makes it a little bit easier to read. And you can just think about, okay, we're not even talking about this optional anymore. We're just talking about the value of that optional in kind of a local context. Everyone prefers to do it differently. I've seen both ways done, and they're both fine. They work the same way. It's just kind of up to you which one you want to use. Okay, so now we're going to get to our last example of optionals, which is called an implicitly defined optional. So we're going to have some var, we'll call it implicit string, which is going to be of type string, and then this exclamation point denotes that it's a implicitly unwrapped optional. So what this is a little bit of a strange concept. It's an optional that can always be treated just as a value. So you never need to do anything like force unwrapping if you want to use it. So here we have just print the implicitly unwrapped string, and we're going to get, let's just, hello. Let's give it a quick definition. If we print this, it's just going to treat it like a regular string. We can kind of contrast that up with what we have above. Where do we have it? Where if we want to print a converted number, we're going to get an optional inside of our print statement, as opposed to just the actual value, which is 1, 2, 3. And you might be wondering, why are we going to ever use an implicitly unwrapped string over just a value, right? Because if you just treat it like a value, but it's still an optional and can still have nil, you could probably run into some super unsafe behavior, which is very true. So what we kind of see, we're going to get nil here, which is not something we really want of a value. And I brought up a quick example of when we'd kind of use this. Just any sort of constructor or an object, you're going to have a lot of variables associated with it, right? And in the constructor, we're just going to go through and give those all values. And if we know those values will never change, we can use an implicitly unwrapped optional just to kind of say that, hey, right now we know this doesn't have a value, but we're 100% sure that down here somewhere, it's just going to be set to some value, even if it's just, in this case, an empty string or, whatever. It's going to be set to something. We can use an implicitly unwrapped optional to kind of make that situation easier and let us not have to unwrap an optional every single time when we're going through our code, because we know it's just from the start it's given a value, even if we don't declare it as having a value in the beginning. Okay, these are pretty unsafe if you use it outside of a constructor, and even using it with a constructor, if your constructor isn't super well defined, can be a little bit unsafe, because really there's no good way of checking this, and you could get some serious crashes in your app. So just my advice would be to use this only in a constructor. If you want to be super safe, you can always use a regular optional instead of an implicitly unwrapped optional to get any task done. Okay, so this is just a little bit for ease of programming, even if it is a little bit less safe. Okay, so just going over everything again, we have defining an optional. We just use a question mark, and this can either be a value or 1. So right here I changed it a little bit. I declared it to be 1 initially, then I set it back to nil right here. This is something you can't do with a regular integer. Nothing that's not an optional can ever be set to be nil. You'll get an error like that. Okay. Apple uses it a lot in their local libraries. So like string casting to an int, we're going to have this return an optional type that we're going to need to deal with later, right? We can check if an optional contains a value using not equal to nil inside an if statement, and just when we're in this if statement's context, we know, hey, this optional has value. We can also, if we want to use that optional inside this if statement, we can do what's called force unwrapping, which is really only safe inside an if statement. Outside of that, we're not going to, outside of that, we know we're not going to really have a safe context to use it. So we can do force unwrapping like here. We can just say converted number force unwrap, and it'll work. Certainly there'll be some cases where it'll work, right? We know right there it has value. But if we're not doing this checking, we can get our app to crash pretty easily, which can lead to some seriously unwanted results, right? Okay, the method I use to unwrap optionals and check if they're safe is called optional binding, or shadowing, some people call it, which is where you just assign it to be some variable for use in local context, and then, or in this case, a let statement, and then we just use it in that local context as the local variable. I like that. I think it's easy to read. And then we talked about implicit strings, which are just generally used in constructors. They're not very safe, but they give you a nice way of not having to do optional checking if you know that a value is going to be defined from one point on, like I described as being used in the constructor of an object. Okay, hopefully that cleared up kind of some of the mysticism of optionals. It's kind of a unique concept. I really haven't heard about it being used outside of Swift. I'm sure there are examples. But it's just a unique solution to a common problem in computer science, and I think it's really cool that we have this as a tool. Okay, so if you have any questions, make sure to just look up Apple's documentation. I'm sure there's some great articles out there about how to use optionals. And just feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll respond to all comments with an answer to the best of my ability. So thanks. Have a great day.